The next speaker is Constant Bonard, who can start sharing his screen now. He will be talking about the expressive principle of relevance. Constant, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen all right and hear me? Yes, okay. So yes, so the plan of the talk is to first talk about the underdeterminacy of non-ostensive emotional expressions, explain what I mean by that, and then present why it constitutes a problem for relevance theory. And then I'll present the solution I favored, which is the introduction of what I call the expressive principle of relevance. And in case you need to go already, here it is, this expressive principle of relevance. It's my take-home message. It says that in an interaction, emotional expressions, including spontaneous, non-ostensive ones, carry a sufficient presumption of relevance to automatically trigger the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure. Something I'm exposed in this paper that was published here, Journal of Pragmatics. So let's go on with the first. So I can hear some noises. I don't know if somebody has forgotten to put out their mic, but that's okay. So imagine you're walking with a friend of yours and you see a dog and then a duck, another duck, another dog, and then you see these two cuties and your friend goes like this. So if you're like me, you will understand her to express the emotion of being moved. She's touched by this display of friendship between two species. And now imagine this other scenario. You're walking, you see a dog, a duck, etc. And then you see this dead rabbit, and your friend goes like this. If you're like me, you will understand her to express sadness at the death of this poor little rabbit. It's the same facial expression, but doesn't express the same emotion, right? Here is another story. This is a photo I took my partner when she was visiting me in the States, and it was her birthday, and she was watching this video, and she cried not because she was sad, she cried because she was touched once again by the display of friendship that her friends, once again, that her friends displayed by sending a video inviting her to a secret party that they organized for her, and she was like really touched by this, and she cried. She could have had the same expression by looking at a sad video, right, and being sad. In general, my point here is that facial expressions are ambiguous in some way. Their natural code doesn't determine what emotional kind they express. And even the basic emotions that Ekman talks about can, in different circumstances, in different contexts, be interpreted to express different emotions. So for instance, here, this is the facial expression that's supposed to express disgust, and it does express disgust in this context, but here it's interpreted to express anger, here sadness, and here fear. Here is a facial expression that Ekman would classify normally as anger, but it's an expression of joy because Serena Williams just scored important points here. Same here with LeBron and Giannis. They are boastful, they are proud, they don't feel angry, they just scored important points once again. So basically, lots of facial expressions can mean different emotions, right? Even non-ostensive ones. I'm focusing on non-ostensive emotional expressions. And this is not just the case for facial expressions, it's also the case for vocal expression. For instance, here is a code put forward by Yuslin and Lauka that's supposed to tell you well, if you hear this set of acoustic cues, then this is going to be an expression of anger. If you hear this set of cues, it's going to be an expression of fear, etc. And there are examples where you hear these cues and it's not an expression of anger. I'm not going to display examples, but I hope you trust me. Same is true for laughter. So laughter, the same sound can express lots of different things. That's something I talk more about in this paper that will be forthcoming soon, hopefully. Yeah. So codes for emotional expressions in the sense of natural codes, as Tim Wharton uses it, for instance, don't determine what emotional kinds are expressed.
In progress.
This maximum.
Oh, what? Is there somebody trying to communicate?
No, there was somebody who popped into the meeting. I muted that person,
Okay.
so that should be.
Yep. So codes don't determine what emotional kinds are expressed, but furthermore, non-ostensive emotional expression imply a more radical kind of underdeterminacy because they don't encode what emotions are about. So if you just perceive an emotional expression, a facial expression, for instance, you cannot see what the expression is about. You have to guess, you have to make some hypotheses, some assumptions, you have to perform some inferences to know what the emotion is about. Though we do it very easily, naturally, effortlessly, automatically, without being conscious of these kinds of inferences. You directly know that her emotion is about these two cuties and not about the other things in the scene, though her gaze will be insufficient to infer that. It's because you know how your friends would react given certain circumstances. You know what they care about, how they would react to what kind of stimuli, basically. I can give you some more examples, but actually, in the interest of time, I think I will skip them. Basically, these were examples where, once again, it's clear that we understand what the emotions are about, and they can be about different things depending, given the same context. Emotions can be about different things depending on what emotions is understood to be expressed. But yes. So, nevertheless, despite this double kind of underdeterminacy, so both with respect to what kind of emotion is expressed and with respect to what the emotion is about, we effortlessly interpret non-ostensive emotional expressions with respect to what emotions express and what they are about. How do we do that? My claim is that we interpret them just like we interpret ostensive stimuli, thanks to our cognitive mechanisms for pragmatic interpretation. And why? Because emotional expressions, even non-ostensive ones, carry a sufficient presumption of relevance to automatically trigger pragmatic interpretation. And once again, this is what I claim in this paper. Now, why is that a problem for relevance theory? I'll come to that in a bit, but first, let me note that spontaneous emotional expressions are typically, at least, very often not perceived as ostensive. However, we do seem to deploy pragmatic interpretation to disambiguate them, and I'm going to substantiate this claim just now. So think again about Pauline's case with her birthday video. So I think in this case, the emotional expression is interpreted by an audience, I guess, through an inferential process that is typically unconscious, implicit, spontaneous, and fast. A process that is guided by a presumption of relevance. I'll say more about this in a moment. Whereby we take the information that is encoded in the emotional expression. So maybe it's something like this type of facial expression can mean being sad or being moved, touched. And thanks to our mind reading ability and background knowledge, so for instance, taking into account the fact that her friends are very important to her, she's seen them quite recently, so she doesn't miss them yet, so probably she's not sad because she misses them. Thanks to that, we enrich the encoded information. So it's not that she's sad, but she's rather moved. And furthermore, we think, well, she's moved by her friend's video, by its display of their affection. And we may also complement this information, for instance, by inferring that Pauline is grateful, that this moment will be engraved on her memory, that she's looking forward to seeing her friends again. And we do that by following a path of least effort, probably, whatever comes to mind first, until the resulting interpretation meets our expectation of relevance. So if you don't care much about Pauline's story, maybe you stop at the interpretation that she's probably moved for some reason, and you don't go further to infer that this moment will be engraved on her memory. And even if you care, you will stop interpreting at a certain point. So you may not take into account the fact that she put her hand in front of her mouth like this, and you won't interpret that because you've already reached your expectation of relevance before. Now, these properties 1 to 8, they correspond to the properties of the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure, as it is notably outlined in the handbook entry Relevance Theory by Wilson. Okay, so now I can formulate why there is a problem in the form of a trilemma. The first horn of this trilemma is that if a comprehension procedure possesses the set of properties 1 to 8 that I've just talked about, it is an instance of the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure. The second horn is that the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure is deployed only by stimuli perceived as ostensive. This is a claim that was already made or suggested, at least in the 1986 book, and it was then made stronger with the claim that the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure is implemented by a module which is activated exclusively by ostensive stimuli. And the third horn of the trilemma is that there is at least one kind of comprehension procedure that possesses the set of properties 1 to 8, and that is deployed for stimuli perceived as non-ostensive. And this case is the interpretation of non-ostensive emotional expressions. I've substantiated this claim with the example of Pauline's birthday, but I could have illustrated with the other examples I've given above how it's very plausible that we interpret emotional expressions and non-ostensive emotional expressions through the set of properties 1 to 8. At least if we find it plausible that the set of properties 1 to 8 is deployed for ostensive cases. It should be just as plausible for these cases, it seems to me. So my proposal is that we should reject claim B, that the comprehension procedure, relevance theoretic comprehension procedure, is deployed only by stimuli perceived as ostensive. And this would be more plausible perhaps through the acceptance of the expressive principle of relevance, which says once again that emotional expressions in an interaction, including non-ostensive ones, are relevant enough to automatically trigger pragmatic interpretation, to automatically trigger the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure. And I'm now going to give you an argument for this claim, for holding the hypothesis that this principle is true. The first premise of this argument is that if S displays an emotional expression, then S appraises at this moment some X, some objects, whatever, in their cognitive environment to be highly relevant. If you are afraid of something, for instance, and you display a fearful expression, this means, if you're sincere at least, that you appraise something as relevant to your safety and highly relevant to your safety. And this is based on a consensus in affective sciences, which is that all emotion theorists agree, or at least a big proportion of emotion theorists, or most the emotion theorists that are dominant today, at least, agree that for an object to elicit an emotion, that object must in some way be relevant to the person experiencing the emotion. This is something we've written about with Tim Wharton, Daniel Dukes, Dave Sander, and Steve Oswald in this paper. And we argue that the term relevant used by affective sciences is, in important respects, targeting the same property as the term relevance in relevant theory. Yeah. The second premise of the argument is that if S and H are interacting and S appraises at this moment some X in their cognitive environment as highly relevant, then X is likely to be highly relevant to H as well. Why is that? Well, first, because what is relevant to S may well be relevant to H. So if we're interacting and you go like, wah! You may be afraid by something, you probably are afraid by something that is relevant to me too. If we're interacting, you go like, well, I'm not a very good actor, but you express admiration or something of that sort. Probably this is also going to be relevant for me as well. So perhaps you observe somebody displaying a wonderful basketball move, and I'd be like, I want to see that too. But even if it's not relevant, if it's relevant to you but not relevant to me, it's going to be highly relevant to our interaction. Because if you appraise something as highly relevant to you during our interaction, it's going to change what is manifest to you at this moment. You're going to concentrate your attention on that. This may probably change the question under discussion in our interaction. It will probably change also our shared goals. You may want to escape, or you may want to watch the basketball game, or things of that sort. So our interaction will be modified because this event is relevant to you. So even if it's not relevant to me, it's going to be relevant directly. It's going to be relevant to me because of how it modifies our interaction. Third premise, if X is likely to be highly relevant for the audience, H, it is worth for H to put in the effort of figuring out what is this X that is highly relevant to S, and whether it is also highly relevant to them, and how it is it. And therefore, this just follows logically. If S and H are interacting and S displays an emotional expression, it is worth for H to put in the effort of figuring what is X, what is the object of the emotion, and whether it is really highly relevant to them as well. And I'd argue that if we accept this, then there's a good reason why emotional expression in an interaction would be relevant enough to automatically trigger pragmatic interpretation. It makes sense that emotional expressions automatically trigger this pragmatic interpretation because they need to be interpreted pragmatically, in the sense that they are underdetermined. Their meaning is underdetermined, if you like. We don't know what is the emotional kind in many cases, and all cases we don't know what the emotion is about. These need to be interpreted, and it's highly relevant. So it's normal that it automatically triggers such pragmatic interpretations. That's basically the argument. I reached the conclusion, which is just a recap. Emotional expressions are doubly underdetermined with respect to what emotion kinds they express and with respect to what the emotion is about. However, we effortlessly, automatically disambiguate emotional expressions. And I would say, just like we do for ostensive stimuli, thanks to the same cognitive mechanisms for pragmatic interpretation, I believe. And this leads me to the proposal that emotional expressions in an interaction, including non-ostensive ones, and in particular, yes, even though emotional expressions are clearly perceived as non-ostensive, they nevertheless convey a presumption of sufficient relevance to automatically trigger pragmatic interpretation. And I have offered an argument for this principle based on a consensus in affective sciences. And I have another one that is based on claims about the evolution of pragmatic interpretation, but didn't have time to present that. If you'd like to talk about it in the future, I'd be happy to. And yeah, I hope that this the possible consequences of this principle would be worth exploring in future works. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Constant. That's also right on time. Very interesting proposal. There is plenty of time. Everybody can hear me, yeah? Yeah, okay, good. So there's plenty of time for questions. So I'd like to ask people who would like to talk to raise their hand like Christophe just did. So Christophe, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for this interesting talk. My question is, I follow your arguments that some automatic processing is going on. I just don't understand why these arguments support the idea that display of emotions is comprehended in the comprehension module rather than, say, in a different emotion reading module.
Okay. Well, the idea is, maybe I can go back actually to my presentation just to make things clear. It's the idea is that the comprehension procedure module is defined through a set of properties that also seem to be instantiated by the interpretation of non-ostensive emotional expressions. So one could argue that there are two modules, one that is dedicated to ostensive stimuli and another one that is dedicated to the interpretation of emotional expression. And that seems coherent, but then it's kind of weird that they share all these properties and they are not identical. And if we turn to evolution, evolution usually is parsimonious. So why would have evolution selected two different kind of mechanisms to play the same role, to have the same kind of features, same kind of properties? Seems more plausible that it's the same mechanism that is at play in the two cases. That's the idea. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does. I just don't follow it yet completely, but I've asked my question and we can maybe discuss it further somewhere else.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Tom was next in the line.
Thank you, Didier. Thank you, Constant, for the talk. It's very thought-provoking. I've always found emotions quite hard to think about from a communicative point of view, so it's good to get fuel, as it were, for that thinking process. I want to ask about two distinctions that seem to me quite important, and if I understood it right, didn't too much feature in your talk, and what role they might play in the picture you're trying to paint. So one distinction is between, I think commonly made between volitional and spontaneous expressions of emotions. So famously Duchenne and non-Duchenne laughter, but the point generalizes, right? I can fake all sorts of emotions, and those fake productions seem to me, yeah, they're very similar to, other obviously ostensive stimuli like pointing and shrugging and so on and so forth. Does that distinction between volitional and spontaneous make any difference? And the other distinction is between, is it worth making a distinction between the emotion itself and the expression of the emotion? And does that go anywhere in your framework? Yeah, I think those are my two distinctions, and I'm curious about where they fit, if at all.
Thank you. So I'm not sure about what's the relevance of the second question. So maybe I'll ask you to clarify that. But concerning the first distinction between volitional and non-volitional expressions, I think that this is, I mean, it's surely a distinction worth making, but probably the distinction that is more relevant to me is whether the expression is perceived as volitional or non-volitional, right? And so in this case, it probably would make a difference, because if you perceive the expression to be volitional, it's very close to be ostensive, right? Because ostensive, well, you define it a little differently, but normally it's yeah, you define it as making manifest an informative intention. And so surely there are cases where people display emotional expression with the intention to make manifest their informative intention. And these are cases that are just treated normally by relevance theory, I think. But so the cases that really interest me are the cases where expressions are not perceived to be volitional, or at least not ostensive. But yes, so I think that's very common, that we see emotional expressions and we perceive them as being non-volitional, and still all of what I've said, I think, apply to these cases. So I've talked about non-ostensive cases, but yeah, I could have rephrased most of that too by talking about non-volitional expressions without problem, I think. Yes.
Do you want me to go on the other distinction now?
Yes, because I distinguish the two, just to say briefly, because I think that emotions are complex phenomena that have different components, behavioral components or attitudinal components, physiological components, phenomenological components, cognitive components that happen, during the elicitation process, for instance, and so expressions are linked with behavioral and physiological components.
Okay.
So the part.
Okay, so you would make a distinction between the emotion and the expression of the emotion, and you don't think that distinction has any particular implications for the picture you're drawing.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea is that expressions are parts basically of emotions, and it's the part that we can perceive basically, and so we need more to infer what is the other part basically, or if you like, that would be a way to put it, perhaps.
All right, we still have time for a question, maybe two. All right, so Constant, maybe I have something which is a little bit of a follow-up to Tom's question. I'm thinking of those cases where you see someone sort of sweating at the temple, which is an indication of anxiety, or somebody, I don't know, rolling up their collar because they're cold. The first example is better, but my point is that you will interpret those indicators as indicative of some emotion, but are they to be treated in the same way that the facial reaction of your partner is, or is this on a different level? But my fear is that if they are on the same level, then you will find your expressive, I forget what the name is now, expressive principle of relevance having to deal with thousands of stimuli at any given point.
Yeah, so that's a worry, a more general worry that we can have with this introduction of an expressive principle of relevance, that if you open the door to all the kinds of stimuli, then, aren't you letting in so many different things? So one way to restrict these things that doesn't seem artificial to me is that we probably have some kind of innate, hardwired kind of encoded abilities with respect to emotions that are special. It's plausible that we have evolved to read certain signs as signs of emotions. So, and this can be substantiated by the fact that other species seem to have particular kinds of, emotional signs that they understand. And we probably are not different in that respect. And Ekman's work probably also points to something that's true, that all across the world in different cultures, there seem to be commonalities between emotional expression. So that would be one way to go and say, well, the set of emotional stimuli is not artificial. It's restricted by the code for emotional expressions we've inherited from evolution. But to be honest, I don't think that that's very satisfying. Because
sorry, Constant.
There are other signs that are not in this set that seem to be interpreted through the same mechanisms, and so we can wonder whether, things outside emotions would also count. And I don't have a definite answer to that, but I think we shouldn't be too afraid of this. I think we shouldn't,
Sure.
underestimate to interpret different kind of signs.
Okay. But thank you for addressing my question. I'm afraid in the interest of time, we have to stop the discussion here, but I'd love to carry on with this discussion at some later stage.